To do a first stage flasking on a full upper denture, I need my full upper denture wax up, all nice and clean, ready to go, everything smooth, no wax on the teeth. I need my flask. The flask has 4 parts. It's got a bottom, a top, a knockout plate which goes in the bottom, and a lid which goes on the top. And Vaseline. Vaseline is going to act as our separator. I'm going to take a good bunch of Vaseline and I'm going to Vaseline the inside of the flask really well. This is where you get to use a lot of Vaseline. You don't want your stone to get stuck inside the flask when we're finished. So you can put this on pretty thickly. Everything else that we do with that Vaseline, we do just a very thin layer. For this, I'm going to do a pretty good thick layer. For the denture, what I'm going to do is put Vaseline on all of the exposed stone. So every bit of stone that I can see, I'm going to put Vaseline on. This, I don't need it to be a thick layer. All I need to do is get a little bit of Vaseline on there. This is going to separate our model from our flasking stone. Okay, so that's now separated. To do the flasking, I'm going to need a mix of stone and plaster. So this is half stone, half plaster. We call this half and half. We do that because stone is too hard and takes too long to set. Plaster is too soft and sets pretty quickly. So when we mix the two of them together, we get a material which just works beautifully for our flasking. This is a half a cup of stone with a half a cup of plaster. That's enough to do one flasking. I want this to be a fairly thick mix. I'm using a vacuum spatulator. I always use a vacuum spatulator to mix my stone for flasking. And there we are. Let's vibrate this a little bit. Now I'm going to put this into the bottom of the flask. I should mention that the flasks that you have are specific for upper and lower. This is an upper flask because the bottom of the flask is flat. If this were a lower flask, such as this one, the bottom is higher at the back of the flask than at the front. So I've mixed this stone up fairly thick. I want it to be pretty thick for this first layer of flasking. So I put the denture down into the stone, and I'm just going to seat the denture into the stone. Just going to push it down gently. If my stone is fairly thick, you can see how it kind of rises up around the model, and it makes like a rounded wave. What I don't want is I don't want the denture to just kind of sink right through that stone and then have the stone flow all over the wax. I want my wax to stay nice and clean. I don't want any of the stone to get onto the wax. So by having a fairly thick mix that kind of curls away from my denture, it makes it a little easier for me. And I'm just pulling the material, pulling the excess out to the side of the flask. And now I can use my spatula and I'm just going to cut around. at the height of the flask. So what I want is I want the stone to fill all of the area under and around the model. And I want it to be smooth with the flask, and I want the metal of the flask to show perfectly clean all the way around. And this stone should be nice and smooth. If I get a little bit of stone on the wax there, I'm not going to worry about it. The stone's not going to stick to the wax. I can clean that off later. All I'm trying to do now is make sure that everything is nice and smooth. This is easy, fairly easy to control with a thick mix, and it also goes pretty fast. If you try and do this with a thin mix, the stone just keeps flowing around and it doesn't keep its shape as you work with it. Now, you want to clean this just as much as it needs. Don't play with it. As you play with it, the stone will tend to slump and change its shape, and you want it to keep this nice clean shape. I want to make sure that I don't create any undercut. So you see I've created nice rounded smooth shapes where the stone rises up to meet the model all the way around there. So I'm going to let this stiffen up, go to an initial set, and then I can just smooth it with my finger. That's all you need to do, is let it stiffen a little, put some water on your finger, and then just with a wet finger I can smooth the stone right out. And I can also clean off the brass of the flask. The brass has to be completely clean. I want to see these nice straight lines at the front and the back of the flask. You have to see that nice straight line across there. If you've got any little waviness to it, that means that there's stone over the flask. The stone also comes to the land area of my model. So this model's got a fairly thin land area, so it's hard to see there. But I've sunk the model in. Just trying to define it a little more for you. I've sunk the model until the model is just, the land area of the model is level with the top of the flask, or with the edge of the flask. So I've got flask, stone, land area all at the same level. And I just have to let this finish setting, and then I can clean it off with a little more water. The stone around the flask will just clean off by putting a little water on this, and my first stage of flasking is done.